Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a fantasy audiobook recommendation video. Basically, I read a lot of fantasy, and most of the time I do prefer to physically read it just because fantasy books, at least epic fantasy, tends to involve really complicated world building and magic systems, and it can be nice to be able to actually read the words on the page. But obviously I've made a video, so there are exceptions to that rule. These are audiobooks that I think work really well in the fantasy genre, and I want to recommend them to you all if you're looking for something new to read. I read a lot of audiobooks, and I've definitely done recommendation videos before, so I'm going to have them linked in the cards and description box if you want even more recommendations after this. All that being said, let's get started. First up, we have the Chorus of Dragons series that starts with The Ruin of Kings, all by Jenn Lyons. And this is an epic fantasy series that is told over multiple POVs. At the beginning of the story, we follow a young man named Kieran who possibly finds out that he is a lost prince. But really the story, again, involves a multitude of characters, and their stories intertwine. The larger story involves gods that are reborn and reincarnation, and just a lot of really interesting concepts. This book does get really heavy into a lot of diverse aspects of the cultures that you explore, so you get to find out about different gender norms and cultural ideas around sexuality and gender identity and all of that. So if that is something you're looking for, you would definitely find in these books. But the reason specifically I want to talk about the audiobook versions is that this is how I always want to reread these books now, because they are so bingeable. The stories are told through multiple narrators, different voices for the different male and female characters, and I really think it works well because it really brings the story to life. There's a lot of humor in the story that I think could get lost if you're just reading it on the page, but again, the voices really enact those little entertaining moments. And this book actually involves a lot of footnotes, which normally is something I would not recommend reading in an audiobook format, but they have another voice that does the footnotes, and they're done so well. They're so funny, and the way they're interjected, it's really obvious as a footnote, so it's not confusing to listen to, and instead actually really works well. So I really recommend, if you're going to try these books, do the audiobook versions. They absolutely bring the story to life, and they are so bingeable. They're big books, but I just flew through them because they were so much fun to read. Highly recommend this series. Next, I want to talk about The Shadow Glass by Josh Winning, and this is a story of a man whose father was a renowned puppet maker and movie filmmaker in the 1980s, and his father's passed away, and so his son is taking care of his business and house. However, he finds out that the puppets that his father created are possibly real. This is more of an urban fantasy, a dark fantasy, but definitely not horror, that is inspired by the work of Jim Henson. And so I want to recommend this one because, again, I do think that epic fantasy often lends itself better to being read on the page, but this one is a lot lighter in tone and style. It's easy enough to follow on audio. And the narrator himself, I want to say, has this accent that just makes the book feel very cozy to me as a North American reader. And so I just found this book to be really charming. And again, there isn't really complex world building or magic to worry about, so it was easy to follow. And yeah, the audiobook narrator really, again, just brought this book to life. I think it's definitely the way to check it out, and definitely recommend it that way. Next up, we have the Burnt Empire series by Ashok Banker, the first book being Upon a Burning Throne. And this is an epic-inspired fantasy that is pulled from the author's own voice's heritage. This is East Indian fantasy that involves the gods of the Hindu mythology. In the story, it is set in a past, and we follow a couple of different characters, actually several characters, but the main setup is that there are two princes that are possibly in line for the throne, and in order to determine if they are worthy, they have to be placed on this burning throne, and if it does not consume them, if it does not burn them, then they are deemed to be worthy. There's also a young girl that is put through this test as well. The two boys survive the test, and this is just the prologue, this is just the setup. However, because one is blind and the other one is albino, they are deemed to not be worthy fully to take the throne by themselves, so instead they are tasked to rule together. This is a story that I describe as kind of a love letter, things like, Game of Thrones and all of that, where you have different people vying for the throne, that very classic setup that you see in so many books. And I think that this one, while it leans into some of those tropes, also feels very original. The world building is vast, you have different cultural ideas, different characters, and I love that the characters are very morally complex. This book is also very feminist and deals with a lot of really interesting cultural ideas and conversations that happen within the story. But the reason I wanted to recommend the audio is that I first read this physical copy and I liked the book, but it's complex. I gotta admit, there's a lot going on. And again, normally when a book is really complex, that's when I prefer the physical copy. But I decided to reread it right after finishing it. I literally finished the book and then picked up the audiobook immediately and reread the whole thing. It's done by one of my favorite narrators. I believe he does a lot of East Indian work. And so it really helped with the pronunciations of a lot of the characters, and more so the gods and the different names that weren't necessarily familiar to me. And again, it just brought the book to life. It really made the characters not just flat characters, but instead these robust characters that were, again, morally gray and complex and had their own motivations. And I feel like the audiobook narration just really brought that to the forefront of the story and made me absolutely love it. So I continued on in that format with the second book, and I definitely recommend doing the audiobook if you get a chance. Next up, we have The Rise and Fall of D.O.D.O by Neal Stephenson and Nicole Galland. And this is more of an urban fantasy. So again, much more accessible, not a lot of heavy world building. The basic setup is that we follow this linguistics expert that gets pulled into this mysterious society. And it kind of reads like a thriller. There's a bit of time travel element, so it also leans a little bit into sci-fi, which of course is Neal Stephenson's usual go-to. But this book is just fantastical and entertaining and silly and fun. And again, I think that having the audiobook narration, which is done by multiple narrators, really again, it brings the story to life and puts that humor to the forefront, which again, I don't always catch the same level of humor when a book is just being read on the page by myself, but when it's actually performed, that's when I'm like, oh, this book is really funny, and this book is really funny. So definitely one I would recommend if you enjoy something a little bit lighter, and again, just want that really good performance, because the voices just all go all out without being over the top and really give you not just a reading of the book, but a performance. So if that's what you look for, this is definitely one to put on your radar. Next up, we have Kaikeyi, and this is an epic standalone fantasy novel that is inspired by East Indian culture. We follow a young woman who, growing up, her mother told her stories of the Hindu gods and mythology. Her father, the king, has banished away her mother now, and that leaves this young woman in a very difficult spot. She is supposed to take her place as a woman, which basically means being married off. However, she potentially has some magical abilities and decides to go and find her own destiny. This book leans into a lot of the classic tropes of fantasy, but it feels oh so fresh because of the context of the world building. And this is one that I want to recommend on audiobook for similar reasons to the reason I want to say to do The Burnt Empire on audio, because again, you get a narrator who I believe his own voices and takes the time to really pronunciate a lot of the names that are introduced in this book, the places, all of that, and things that just honestly, if I'm reading it on the page, I wouldn't know how to pronounce it. And again, I just feel like it really fleshes out the book to get that performance. So this is the book that I read first physically, and then actually went back when I got an opportunity to do the audiobook and read it again and loved it so much more once I got that holistic experience. So again, if you're interested in this book, if you can, check out the audiobook. I really think that I gotta stop saying it. I keep saying it with every book, but it really brings the book to life, and that is why I love audiobooks so much. Next, I want to talk about A Hero Born by Yong. This is the first book in the Hero of Condor series. This is a fantasy series that involves two men that are bound together at birth by their fathers. They make an agreement that these men will be raised together as pseudo brothers, and together they will learn kung fu, and then we follow them over the years, their adventures and their romance as they grow into men. That's the basic setup. There's a lot that happens, but that gives you a starting place. And I want to recommend the audiobook version for a few reasons. Again, you have the obvious one that you have a narrator who is going to help you with the pronunciation of these names, because this book is written and inspired very much by the ancient Chinese culture. It's translated into English, and so I do think that a narrator who is experienced, because I did look him up and he does have experience with the Chinese language, is a good place to start when you're going into a book like this if you don't have that experience yourself. So I like that aspect, but I also have a secondary reason to recommend this on audio, and that is, for me at least, when it comes to action, I much prefer when it's performed rather than read on the page. And I think it's just for me as someone who prefers to watch action rather than read it. This book is very action-based because of the focus on kung fu, and because of that, I really liked getting to listen to it because you have the narrator bring those parts to life, because again, there's a lot of kung fu battles, and those are the kind of things that I really struggle to focus on when I'm reading, or more so struggle to imagine what's happening. But when someone reads it out loud, I can much more picture it as a movie. And again, these books books to me just felt like a really fun, well done kung fu movie. And so if you love kung fu film, I definitely think you should check this out. And again, for me, I just thought that the narrator really helped explore the humor because these books are really funny while also making the kung fu scenes really fun and easy to imagine. So obviously highly recommend. This is one of my favorite series. And we also have The Drowning Empire by Andrea Stewart, the first book being The Bone Shard Daughter. And this is a multi-POV story where we follow the daughter of the emperor who has lost her memory. She is trying to piece together what has happened to her. And we also follow from the perspective of a scoundrel. He is a smuggler, but a pretty lovable smuggler who is trying to sneak away and find his wife who has disappeared. And of course, eventually their stories connect together. There's also another perspective. But essentially, I want to recommend this story on audio because it has, again, multiple narrators. So we have a female narrator for the daughter and then a male narrator for the smuggler. And especially the narrator for the smuggler is one that I loved because I really felt like he brought him to life and again made this character just so lovable. He really felt like a Han Solo stand-in, but in a way that didn't feel like a stolen perspective, but just very reminiscent of that. And so I really felt again that the narration really brought the characters to life and made me love this book. So if you're someone who likes different voices for different characters and different perspectives, this one makes it really clear how it all breaks down. And while there is a magic system in this one, I don't think it is too complex to listen to because the magic system involves using bone shards and kind of dark magic to put constructs to life, and it involves almost like a coding like magic. And again, I thought it was very well explained, which again, as long as you're not rushing through the audiobook, you're going to be able to easily understand how it works. So really love this one. It's one again that I read first physically and liked it, and then I reread it via the audio and absolutely loved it. So highly recommend this one. Love to see more people checking it out. And I also want to talk about the Witcher series. This is a very iconic story, especially since the Netflix adaptation came out. It follows a man named Geralt who is a witcher, essentially a monster hunter. This is a very episodic series that follows his adventures as he is fighting different monsters that are all inspired by the author's Polish background. And you get to learn about the mythology and folklore of that area of Europe. And I really enjoyed these ones once I switched over to the audiobook versions. And the reason I want to recommend them is basically I found that the prose of these novels to be very hard to get into. Not that I couldn't understand them, not that I couldn't follow them, but the way they were written just did not work well with my brain and I didn't find myself fully immersed in the story. However, I switched over to the audiobook version and then the story really again came to life. And I have heard other people make that same comment, so I don't think it's just me. And so of course these books are translated, so it's hard to know if it's the original writing style or the translation, but I just find that these books work again better on audio form. I do know there's some small complaints with the audiobook narration. At one point Dandelion is called Dandelion and things like that, but if you can look past those flaws, I do think it's a really good way to consume the stories and definitely the way that I plan to finish out the books at some point. And finally we have The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah, and this is an epic fantasy series inspired by the author's Middle Eastern heritage. And this story follows different characters. We're set in a world where jinn exist. However, they're actually hunted down as prey. We follow different characters, one being a prince who is kind of a reluctant prince and is trying to sneak away from the castle and pretend that he is a normal person. We also have a thief who possibly gets involved with the prince. We have a little bit of romantic tension and also action, adventure, intrigue, all the things I love. The world building in this is amazing. And once again, you can probably guess where I'm going with this. I really appreciated reading this book with a narrator who understood how to pronounce a lot of the names and cultural references within this book because I do think that it gave a more authentic experience. I personally really enjoyed it and was enamored by the story. Love this as a debut novel and highly recommend it. I think it's such a complex but also easy to follow story that is great for both beginners and longtime readers of fantasy alike. And yeah, I really loved it and would definitely recommend it if that sounds good to you. Personal favorite of mine once again. So that's it for this video. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And as always, I'd love to get your recommendations for fantasy books that you think work really well in the audiobook format. Don't forget, if you want even more audiobook recommendations, I always have a playlist down below and in the cards. And if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of audiobooks and physical books, particularly in the genres of fantasy, science fiction, horror, and thrillers. If you want to help me out, you can give this video a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a little emoji like a music note or a pair of headphones, and if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.